The summer of 1940 was supposed to mark the end of Britain. Across Europe, country after country had fallen with terrifying speed. Poland had been crushed. Norway had surrendered. Belgium was defeated in just 18 days. The Netherlands collapsed in only 5. France, considered one of the strongest military powers in the world, had fallen in barely 6 weeks. Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his power, commanding the greatest war machine Europe had ever seen. Almost every military expert believed Britain would be next. Yet in the middle of that seemingly unstoppable conquest, just 8 words spoken by one man changed the mood of an entire nation, and according to historians and wartime intelligence, they forced Hitler to confront something he had never expected: an enemy that simply refused to break. Those 8 words weren't a declaration of victory. They weren't a secret military code or a revolutionary battle plan. They were far more dangerous. They represented an idea that no bomb could destroy and no army could conquer. By the end of this story, you'll discover the exact 8 words Winston Churchill spoke, why Hitler reportedly found them so unsettling, how they reshaped the psychological battlefield of World War II, and why decades later military historians still study them as one of the greatest examples of leadership under impossible pressure. The deeper you go into this story, the more you'll realize this wasn't just about a speech. It was about changing the course of history without firing a single shot. Before we continue, think about this for a moment. Imagine your country standing completely alone against the most powerful military force on Earth. Every newspaper predicts your defeat. Your closest allies have already surrendered. Enemy aircraft fill the skies above your cities every day. Would words still matter? Or would they become the only weapon capable of keeping hope alive? Keep that question in your mind, because by the end, you may never look at leadership or courage the same way again. By the time Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, Britain wasn't celebrating. It was panicking. His appointment didn't come during victory parades or peaceful elections. It came during one of the darkest political crises in British history. Neville Chamberlain had lost the confidence of Parliament after Germany's lightning-fast victories across Europe. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped in France, surrounded by advancing German armies. Every hour seemed to bring another disastrous report from the front lines. Many believed Britain's defeat was simply a matter of time. Families expected invasion. Newspapers published instructions for surviving air raids. Local defense volunteers prepared roadblocks in case German troops landed on British beaches. Children were evacuated from cities. Windows were blacked out every night. Across southern England, defensive barriers appeared almost overnight. Every ordinary citizen could sense history accelerating around them. Yet amid this growing anxiety, Churchill spoke with remarkable certainty. His speeches never promised an easy victory. They never claimed Britain wouldn't suffer. Instead, they offered something far more powerful: purpose. One of Churchill's greatest strengths was his ability to acknowledge terrifying realities without surrendering to despair. Many leaders choose between honesty and optimism. Churchill blended both. He openly admitted the dangers ahead while convincing millions that enduring those dangers was not only possible, but necessary. That balance became one of his greatest weapons. It also confused Hitler. Nazi intelligence carefully monitored Churchill's speeches. German propagandists tried to portray Britain as exhausted and divided, yet Churchill's broadcasts repeatedly produced the opposite effect. Public morale stabilized. Recruitment remained strong. Civilian determination hardened after every bombing campaign instead of collapsing. Each attempt to intimidate Britain seemed to strengthen its resistance. This was not what Hitler expected. Then came the speech that history would never forget. The setting itself carried enormous weight. Britain had escaped catastrophe at Dunkirk, but few celebrated. Saving hundreds of thousands of soldiers was remarkable, yet everyone understood the larger truth. The war had not been won. France was collapsing. German armies controlled most of Western Europe. Britain stood almost completely isolated. Churchill rose before Parliament knowing every sentence would echo across the world. Millions listening desperately searched for reassurance. Instead of offering comforting illusions, Churchill painted a brutally honest picture of the struggle ahead. He described the evacuation not as victory but as survival. He warned that difficult days still lay ahead. He spoke of sacrifice, endurance, and national responsibility. Then he reached the words that would become immortal. Words so simple that almost anyone could remember them. Words so determined that even enemies took notice. Words that transformed fear into defiance. We shall never surrender. Only 4 words in modern counting, but the heart of the message, expressed within the surrounding sentence, became one of the defining declarations of World War II. Those few words represented far more than stubbornness. They announced to Hitler, to the British people, and to the entire world that Britain's decision had already been made. Negotiation was finished. Capitulation was impossible. The war would continue whatever the cost. For Hitler, this wasn't merely another speech. It was the collapse of one of his most important assumptions. Everything that followed, from the Battle of Britain to the Blitz and eventually the Allied liberation of Europe, would unfold because one nation refused to accept that defeat was inevitable. And Hitler was about to discover that destroying cities was far easier than destroying conviction. Churchill himself wasn't even the obvious choice. Many politicians distrusted him. Some thought he was reckless, overly emotional, and obsessed with preparing for a war that others had desperately tried to avoid. For years, he had warned that Hitler's ambitions stretched far beyond Germany's borders, but those warnings were often dismissed as exaggerations. Even members of his own political party questioned whether he possessed the discipline needed to lead a nation through its greatest crisis. History would prove those doubts astonishingly wrong. Unlike many European leaders, Churchill had spent years studying dictators. He understood something that many others refused to accept. Hitler didn't negotiate from strength. He negotiated after victory. Every concession offered to him only encouraged the next demand. Churchill believed that giving Hitler what he wanted wouldn't buy peace. It would simply postpone an even greater catastrophe. That conviction would define every major decision he made during the coming years. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler viewed Britain through a completely different lens. His victories had come so quickly that confidence inside the Nazi leadership bordered on arrogance. Poland had collapsed. Denmark had barely resisted. Norway had fallen. Belgium and the Netherlands were overwhelmed. France, despite its massive army and the supposedly impenetrable Maginot Line, had surrendered. To Hitler, these victories confirmed a simple belief. No nation could withstand the speed and power of the German blitzkrieg. Britain, he assumed, would eventually come to the same conclusion. In fact, Hitler wasn't initially determined to invade Britain at all. He admired much of the British Empire and imagined that once France had fallen, British leaders would recognize reality and negotiate a settlement. Several indirect peace feelers appeared through diplomatic channels. While historians still debate exactly how serious those proposals were, what remains clear is that Hitler expected Britain to consider compromise rather than continue fighting alone. There was logic behind that expectation. Britain's military situation looked desperate. Much of its equipment had been abandoned during the evacuation from Dunkirk. Thousands of soldiers had escaped across the English Channel, but tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, ammunition, and heavy weapons had been left behind on French beaches. Britain had preserved its army, but not its firepower. To outside observers, this looked less like a miracle and more like the beginning of the end. Even inside Britain, influential voices urged caution. Some members of the government wondered whether peace negotiations should at least be explored before conditions became even worse. After all, if France had fallen despite possessing one of Europe's largest armies, what realistic chance did Britain have standing completely alone? Churchill listened to every argument. Then he rejected them. His refusal wasn't based on blind optimism. It was based on calculation. Churchill believed that surrender disguised as negotiation would only hand Hitler control over Europe. Britain might temporarily avoid invasion, but its independence would disappear piece by piece. The empire would weaken. Democracy would lose its strongest remaining defender. Most importantly, he believed Hitler's promises could never be trusted. It was an extraordinary gamble. If Churchill was wrong, Britain faced destruction. If he was right, Britain would endure years of unimaginable hardship before victory was even possible. That decision transformed the war. Far away in Berlin, Hitler struggled to understand this stubborn resistance. Everything about his previous campaigns suggested Britain should already be seeking peace. Military logic pointed toward negotiation. Economic pressure pointed toward negotiation. Strategic isolation pointed toward negotiation. Yet Churchill refused every opportunity. The Führer had conquered territories. He had not conquered resolve. This frustrated German planners more than many people realize today. Military campaigns depend as much on psychology as logistics. If an enemy believes defeat is inevitable, resistance weakens long before resources run out. But if leadership convinces people that victory, or at least survival, remains possible, wars become dramatically more difficult to win. Churchill understood this instinctively. Before Britain could defeat Germany militarily, it first had to defeat fear. And fear was everywhere.